Hi everyone. Alireza Firouzja had a brilliant second day in the Croatia Blitz. So I'm looking back at some of his best games from that day, and this is one that he played against Wesley So here. So he has the white pieces, this is Blitz chess, let's see what happened. So he kicked off with d4, Wesley goes knight f6 here, pawn c4, e6, and after knight c3, Alireza's now invited the Nimzo Indian defence. Wesley takes it up with bishop to b4, and now he goes e3. Very solid, respectable system. Castles from Wesley, and now bishop to d2. So it looks a bit passive here, but white's just staying solid, and later in the game will perhaps look to play pawn to e4. Now we had d5 from Wesley. We had pawn a3, putting a question to the bishop. It now drops back here. Yes, it's come back and forth, arguably losing a tempo, but it did allow the black king to get castled. Black's very solid, now prepares to play c5. So we had knight f3 from Alireza. You don't have to put that knight there, by the way. There are some systems where the knight comes to e2 after the bishop's gone to d3, and then you look to play f3 and e4 or g4. I'll link a game at the end that Alireza played against Lenia Dominguez in a very similar system to that. But in this game, he puts the knight on f3, a more orthodox way to play here. We had pawn b6 now, supporting c5 in future, preparing to fianchetto the bishop. Thanks very much, by the way, for pointing out to me it's fianchetto, not fianchetto. I've learnt a lot actually through this channel on how to say words. Like H versus H. I've been saying H wrong all these years. Anyway, I digress. And now Alireza takes on d5 here. He doesn't want to develop the bishop, then have the pawn take and have to take again. So he takes on d5. We had a recaptures with the pawn. Now he develops the bishop, and Wesley pushes c5. He wastes no time, and he's kind of equalised already when you run this with the engine. But I still prefer white's position here, especially how Alireza handles it. So he goes rook c1. We can see there's action down that file. The bishop comes to b7. Now he castles the king. And now knight c6 is played. It puts pressure on the centre here. And now one of the challenges that white has to solve is how do you unravel this traffic jam of pieces here? You know, open up that bishop pair. You'd love to go e4 under the right circumstances, but there's clearly too much pressure on d4. So instead, Alireza takes on c5, the pawn recaptures, and now he swings this knight around, preparing to come to f4. I really love this maneuver. And this whole way of playing, okay, he's given black the centre. These are known as hanging pawns, where you've got two pawns hanging on the rank like that, not supported by any other pawns here. So they give black space, they cramp the white pieces, but you've opened files here for the heavy pieces, and black has to be careful to maintain these pawns, because if one of them drops, well then the other one will be weak, and so on. So this is the strategic battle now. Wesley now goes knight e4, so a great move. And you might think, well, why are you sticking the knight there? You don't want to break your pawn structure, now the pawns are weak. But here you can't actually take that knight and allow this, because this knight's got no squares, as we can see. It'd have to come back to e1 here, and then let's say bishop a6, and you can see that these pieces are just absolutely miserable, can barely move. So you just can't take that knight off. So instead, Alireza goes queen c2, pressures the knight, and now you could do something solid here like pawn g6 or pawn h6, because still you can't be taking this knight due to the tactical problems. So just to show this line, say you go pawn g6 and white tries to grab a pawn here, well then there's this knight d4 move. You open up the bishop here, say you capture that bishop, well then we take with check, king moves, and you also pick up the rook here. Now, Wesley goes for this same line, but he first takes a moment to protect his bishop to set up this tactic. But actually, he could have protected his king side first with g6 or even h6. But he goes rook to b8. Now, when you get this whole line, the bishop's even defended at the end of the line. So white just can't take here and win a pawn because of that reason. And so here we just had rook f to d1. Alireza brings another piece, blasting on the file. And this is where Wesley now makes a mistake. So he goes queen to b6, which looks so natural, but actually the best move here was bishop to d6 for the key reason that you now cover f4. So if the knight now hops to f4, which we see in the game, pressuring this pawn, well, now you can actually chop it off in certain lines. You can start with knight f6, hopping back, covering these pawns, and then if bishop c3 to try and eliminate that one, well, you can go pawn d4. This is the really nice trick, because now if pawn captures, you lose your knight. Now, white's not forced to go bishop c3, there are better moves, but this just gives a sense of why the bishop belongs on d6, pressuring the knight when it comes to f4. But after queen b6 here, now knight f4, black's got some problems to solve, because this one's attacked, and so is this one if the knight moves. Say you try this to defend the pawn, will you simply take, and then we're picking up here at the end of the line. Instead of going rook f to d8, well, what if you tried to drop back with the knight now to f6, cover everything off? Well, now bishop c3. And because you're about to eliminate that defender, there's no d4. If d4, by the way, you can capture, chop everything off, and this is the sting at the end of the tail, that classic tactic. So it's just very difficult to cover the d-pawn and deal with the threat to the king on h7. And the best move here was actually knight to a5 immediately, opening the bishop to protect, all that kind of stuff. But then you leave the control of e5, the knight hops in, it's threatening a fork here. I mean, I won't keep going deeper and deeper on the line, but it's just really tough for Wesley to actually deal with all the threats. So after knight f4, instead he takes on d2, he thinks, okay, I'm at least going to pick up the bishop pair here, the rook recaptures, and Alireza didn't even bother taking here with check as an in-between move, because there's still pressure here, there's still pressure here, black has to give something up. So knight a5 was now played, it allows takes on h7 with check, the king sidestepped, and Alireza picks up a second pawn here, so he's already got a winning advantage. The bishop now chops this knight, it was attacking both of these pieces, very difficult to live with, the rook recaptured, and now there's a threat to come here, set up discoveries, so g6 played, plus it traps in this bishop, and that one's now forced to give itself up for the pawn. Pawn recaptures. Oh, by the way, you don't go with the queen here and try and get the queens off, or then you can check and you're picking up this knight on a5. You know, that one's a loose piece now. So the pawn recaptures. Now knight e5 hits the pawn, and the best move here actually was rook to f6. You do allow white to play this knight d7 move, forking all those pieces, but then when you take on b2, this is the main line here, well, you can take on b8, win in exchange, yes, but now the queens come off the board, and rook b6 hits that knight and also threatens back rank stuff. So you'd have to make room, then you pick up a piece. Now white's still doing better here, 2 pawns ahead, you bring this rook to the 7th, but it would have been the best practical try for Wesley to actually just go rook f6, allow the fork and play for this one, because when you allow Alireza to take here, which is what happens in the game, well, then you're in some trouble, because after queen takes on b2, which was played, now we had check, the king moves, and Alireza picks up a whole piece here. You don't want to pick up an exchange and then lose your minor piece. You're better to pick up a whole 3 points. So he takes first here with check. Now the rook recaptured. Then he takes on e7, picks up that bishop, and so he's 3 pawns ahead here. Although Wesley does win one back, and it looks really scary, but Alireza's got it covered. So he goes knight to f5, checks the king, then to h4, covers this one, knight b3, hits this one here, but again, Alireza's just very cool and calm now. He actually shifts it up the board to c3, keeps this pawn covered, also keeps an eye on this one. Now it looks really dangerous, because to leave your back rank when there's 2 rooks floating about looks like you're going to get mated, but you can never quite get this in, or then you're losing this rook here. So that's why Wesley shifts it across the board here. Now there is a threat to mate, so the rook drops back. Now this rook comes to c2. I mean, you don't want to be exchanging pieces when you're material down, but what to do when that rook is just holding everything, stopping your passed pawn. So we had an exchange here. The knight hopped back to f3. Pawn a5 now played, and pawn h4 from Alireza. These connected passes, especially the h-pawn, are just such a big problem now. So c4 from Wesley, rook d6 check, king f5 played. Wesley wants to try and stay with these pawns, but now h5 from Alireza. The knight covers this key square as well. Now pawn c3, rook c6 comes behind, and after rook c1 check, king h2, here Wesley actually resigned. I mean, he's only got 4 seconds on the clock as well. Alireza's still got 40, and this pawn's just going to win the game. I mean, say you go c2, h6, rook d1 to clear the way, to come back, but then of course white can just pick up this pawn. Now you're 3 pawns ahead, so it's just hopeless. This is a lost endgame for black. So I hope you enjoyed this game. If you want to see another epic game in this line between Alireza Firouzja and Lenier Dominguez, click here. And to never miss a future video, do consider subscribing, and thanks very much for watching. See you soon.